In the middle of the 20th century, China went through one of the most radical and, frankly, chaotic transformations in all of human history. I mean, in just 15 short years, it would go from a nation completely torn apart by war to a nuclear power. But this incredible rise came at a cost that is almost impossible to wrap your head around. So let's get into the story of the Great Leap Forward and the staggering price of progress.
Okay, so let's set the scene. It's 1949. For decades, China has been scarred by a brutal invasion and then a horrifyingly bloody civil war. But now it's over. Mao Zedong's Communist Party has won. For hundreds of millions of people, a whole new era is about to begin. You can just imagine the feeling of hope and change in a country that had known pretty much nothing but suffering for so long.
So, there he is, standing in Tiananmen Square. Mao delivers this now iconic line, officially founding the People's Republic of China. It was this huge declaration of a national rebirth, right? A promise that China would never be humbled again. But as those red flags were waving and the crowds were roaring, you have to imagine a question was hanging in the air. What kind of country was this new China actually going to be?
Now, on paper, the new state was called a People's Democratic Dictatorship. But let's be real, it was far from democratic. All the power was concentrated in this really rigid, top-down structure. The fate of the entire nation was basically in the hands of a very small group of men. Let's take a quick look at how that power was really organized. Think of it like a pyramid of power, okay? At the bottom, you've got the Central Committee, maybe 100 members or so. A little higher up, you get the more exclusive Politburo. But right at the very top, the absolute center of all power, where every single major decision got made, was the Politburo Standing Committee. We're talking about a tiny handful of guys holding the future of China. And at the head of that committee, the undisputed supreme leader, was Chairman Mao himself. Right there with him were guys like Liu Shaoqi, who was this master party organizer, and the super charismatic Zhou Enlai, who became the face of China to the rest of the world as premier and foreign minister. These were the architects of the new China, the men who would steer the destinies of a quarter of all humanity. So, with all this absolute power in their hands, the party just started radically remaking China. I mean, their goal was to sweep away centuries of tradition and build a totally new society from the ground up, and to do it in just a few years. It was a breathtakingly ambitious project, and one that was going to bring both incredible promise and just as much peril.
And these reforms, they were a mixed bag, a real two-sided coin. On one hand, you had some genuine progress. New laws give women more rights than they'd ever had. They simplified the Chinese script to help tackle the country's huge illiteracy problem. But on the other hand, you had this relentless wave of propaganda and the brutal elimination of so-called counter-revolutionaries, which was basically anyone they decided was an enemy of the state. So freedom was being granted with one hand and then snatched away with the other.
The land redistribution campaign was an incredibly bloody affair. The landlord class, which had dominated world China for centuries, was targeted with ruthless efficiency. They were publicly denounced, put through show trials, and executed in massive numbers. The estimated death toll, it's over 1 million. Just a chilling reminder of the revolution's brutality. But here's the other side of that same coin. Amidst all that violence, the revolution delivered on its biggest promise to the peasants. Something like 300 million people got their own plot of land for the very first time. For them, the party had kept its word. It was a moment of liberation they would remember for generations.
Now, to build a modern industrial country, China looked to its only major ally, the Soviet Union. So the first 5-year plan, which they launched in 1953, was basically a carbon copy of the Soviet economic model. The focus was all on heavy industry, coal and steel, the building blocks of a modern superpower.
And you know what? At first, the results were absolutely astounding. With thousands of Soviet advisors on the ground, China's industrial output just soared. Those ambitious targets for coal, iron, and steel, they didn't just meet them, they completely shattered them. The plan was a roaring success, and it looked like proof that centralized planning worked.
But there was a dark side to this industrial boom. To feed the growing cities and to tighten its control over the countryside, the party forced farmers into these things called agricultural cooperatives. That land they had just been given, it was taken back and pooled into collective farms. By 1956, 80% of rural households had been collectivized, and that newfound freedom was just stripped away. The seeds of a future disaster were being planted.
Then, in 1956, feeling pretty confident, Mao launches the 100 Flowers campaign. He famously said, "Let 100 flowers bloom," encouraging people to offer constructive criticism of the party. But when the criticism actually came, when intellectuals and academics dared to speak up, Mao's response was swift and it was brutal. He unleashed the anti-rightist campaign, a vicious purge that saw at least 500,000 of the people who had spoken out punished, silenced, or killed. The message was crystal clear. In Mao's China, there was no room for dissent. So, with all opposition completely crushed and totally energized by the success of that first plan, Mao launched his second, much more audacious program in 1958. It was a plan that would shake China to its very foundations, a plan he called the Great Leap Forward.
Look, this was more than just an economic plan. It was like a revolutionary crusade. The goal was to just skip the slow, steady process of industrialization. The idea was to catapult China past Western powers like Britain and the US through the sheer force of will of the Chinese people. It was a massive, insane gamble on the power of ideology to just defy the laws of economics. And the result was a catastrophe of biblical proportions. Here's how it all went wrong. They set these wildly unrealistic targets. Local officials who were terrified of failing simply lied. They faked their harvest reports, claiming these huge bumper crops that only existed on paper. So then, based on these lies, the state took way too much grain from the countryside, leaving the peasants with nothing. And to make things even worse, millions of farmers were told to abandon their fields to build these useless backyard steel furnaces. So with less food being grown and way too much of it being taken away, a horrific famine was basically guaranteed. The result of this perfect storm of ideological fervor and systemic failure was one of the most devastating man-made disasters in all of human history. It was a tragedy that would scar China for generations to come. The death toll was just staggering. An estimated 45 million people died. That's around 7% of China's entire population at the time. Entire villages were just wiped off the map, their people starving to death in their own homes. It was a man-made apocalypse, a catastrophe on a scale that is almost impossible to comprehend. The scale of the disaster was just so immense that it couldn't be hidden, not even from the very top of the party. A reckoning was coming, a power struggle that was about to completely reshape the leadership of China. Mao was actually forced to make a rare public self-criticism, and he stepped back from the day-to-day running of the country. A group of more pragmatic leaders, including Liu Shaoqi, Zhao Enlai, and a rising star named Deng Xiaoping, took over. They immediately started trying to undo the damage, shrinking the communes, even allowing some private farming to come back. Their goal was simple: get China producing food again and pull the nation back from the absolute brink of collapse. As China was reeling from the Great Leap Forward, its relationship with the Soviet Union completely shattered. The Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev was horrified by how reckless Mao's policies were. And Mao, in turn, he saw Khrushchev's policy of peaceful coexistence with the West as a betrayal of the revolution. So the two communist giants, who were once allies, were now bitter rivals. It was a split that would totally change the course of the Cold War. But here's the crazy part. Even as it was struggling to recover from the famine, China started flexing its muscles on the world stage. It provoked a crisis with the United States over Taiwan, it ruthlessly crushed an uprising in Tibet, and it won a decisive victory over India in a short border war. And then, in 1964, came the ultimate symbol of national power. China detonated its first atomic bomb, joining the very exclusive club of nuclear powers. And that brings us to the central paradox of this whole era. By 1964, China was a nation on its knees. It was still reeling from one of the deadliest famines in history, its people haunted by starvation and political purges, and yet, at the exact same time, it had become a nuclear power, a nation that could stand up to both the United States and the Soviet Union. The transformation was complete. The Chinese people had, in fact, stood up, just like Mao had promised. They were now a world power. But that journey had been a descent into hell, a journey that cost the lives of tens of millions of people. And so the question that echoes through the decades isn't just at what cost, but was it a price that was even worth paying?